Today I want to explore how Drogheda, which is a town shaped by the sea, was transformed in the 18th century by the forces of maritime trade. So it does sound quite dry and quite wet, but it is actually quite a meaty subject, and I always think if you follow the money, you'll find things can be quite interesting and a lot more nuanced than they sound at the beginning. So this talk will examine how international maritime trade transformed Drogheda during the 18th century, leaving behind a legacy that can still be seen in the town's streets and architecture today. The story of Drogheda in this period is not merely local. It is in fact, I would say, a microcosm of Ireland's position within the broader networks of the Atlantic world, particularly in an empire kind of context. Before I go into it, I just put this up as our opening slide. Please join us. It's obviously not from the 18th century, but I did think it was a great image from it's the NLI's Lawrence collection of the 19th century, very bustling, busy port of Drogheda just there on the North Quay. I just thought it might be useful to set us in the context of a very, very busy and productive maritime port town. And I'll just move into a map now, which will hopefully get a bit more context. So emerging from the shadow of the 17th century, an era of high conflict for Ireland, when you think about the 1641 rebellion, then you have Cromwell's siege in 1649, and then you're happily right into the Williamite Wars there at the end of the century. Essentially by the 18th century, Drogheda had entered this new, a whole new world, and it was very scarred, but also I found through research full of people who are particularly ambitious for the town. The Williamite Charter of 1697, so just at the very end of the 17th century, this restructured the corporation of Drogheda, which granted it significant property and new powers to shape the town's development. Such upheaval in the previous century had significant consequences for the town's urban development. And while the confiscation of Papist properties and their subsequent sale through public auction from 1700 to 1703 gave many Protestant merchants and adventurers, is the term that they often use, a chance to invest in property kind of on a very large scale. And gradually, it gave them a chance to improve their finances and social standings. In tandem, trade in linen, provisions, and general shipping were relied upon to keep the money flowing. The population of the town, it's also worth noting, increased dramatically in this period. So from the end of the 17th century to the beginning of the early 19th century, Drogheda's population grew just over from about 3,000 inhabitants to more than 18,000 inhabitants, which for this era is quite a dramatic expansion in a very quick time. It's over maybe 3 generations. There was clearly a pressure to rebuild and expand, and an era of civic rebuilding and commercial expansion was set in motion. The town's leaders, a blend of merchants, landowners and officials, recognised the opportunity to align Drogheda with the energetic mercantile culture of Britain. They aimed to create a port that was not merely functional, but also emblematic of civic pride and prosperity. In this period, Drogheda was more than a provincial port. As I've said, it's part of the wider world, a town linked by trade, not only to the rest of Ireland, but particularly to Britain. Sorry, I should just point out there, Drogheda's main trading partner is Liverpool, but there was also very significant trade between Bristol and Whitehaven, particularly in the early 18th century, which will have more importance as the talk goes on. These connections brought prosperity, opportunity, and at times moral complexity. The wealth generated through trade built the fine Georgian houses, churches, and civic buildings that are probably still the most prominent of Drogheda's urban landscape today. Yet behind that prosperity lay stories of political upheaval, shifting loyalties, and the darker realities of the transatlantic economy. I should flag at the outset of this talk, in terms of maritime trading, there is little doubt that Drogheda would have had a significant coastal trade with other parts of Ireland. It's kind of a given if we're to follow any of the patterns from what we see in the later 19th century. And also given obviously the numerous familial connections and the geographical proximity. However, due to several factors, the primary written evidence that I can use as a historian is actually, and survives intact, is of maritime trade with international ports. And that's primarily due to the survival of the Customs 19 records. So they're large tomes and volumes that record the import and export through all the ports of the UK and through all the ports of Ireland and the rest of the world. To take you back a little bit, and I think of this sort of section of the talk as a port in transition. In the early decades of the 18th century, Drogheda's economy remained fragile but full of potential. The port was both its lifeline and its limitation. The River Boyne's shallow channel hindered navigation, prompting numerous petitions to improve access for larger vessels. Corporation minutes from 1712 record, and I quote, the needful consideration of deepening the river for the advancement of trade and better accommodation of shipping. These early efforts marked the beginning of Drogheda's transition from a regional market town into an international maritime hub. The corporation's close mercantile links with international trading partners enabled them to seek guidance for the town's development outside of Ireland. An example of this can be seen when two Drogheda aldermen were requested to contact merchants in Liverpool to seek advice on repairing Drogheda's port in 1736. We see Alderman Scholes and Edward Mead are recorded as having written to Robert Armitage and Henry Pippard, both of Liverpool, for advice. They in turn recommended the corporation to seek the opinion of the engineer Thomas Steers, who at the time was based in Liverpool. It's clear from surviving records that both Armitage and Pippard had family based in Drogheda, and they were trusted to procure the mapped scheme from Steers, which was approved by the corporation in 1736. This scheme was to make the River Boyne more navigable and improve the town's port overall, which was an essential element in aiding the town's continued maritime trade. By mid-century, the Custom House books tell us that vessels from Drogheda were regularly bound for ports such as Bristol, Liverpool, and Whitehaven, as outlined on the map, but also Bordeaux in France and occasionally the American colonies. Their cargoes at the time would have included things like tallow, butter, hides, grain, and linen yarn. The import lists, conversely, reveal Drogheda's growing dependence on materials like coal, salt, timber, particularly for building, and iron. They're all essential for urban development and indeed shipbuilding. So I'll just move on here, just to get an idea. I love this picture. It is, I know you're all very familiar with it. It's just a detail from Bewley House of the view of Drogheda from 1718. And I think it's a great insight into this period of the century where you see the scars, you see the scars and the rundown nature of the town after the upheavals of the 17th century. But also you see those Dutch billy gables and the prosperity of building townhouses and very large primate palaces that is essentially a product of a strong merchant class who are quite ambitious. It's particularly interesting when you see how it does develop on, and for that I'll leave Raval's map just up there for a moment. To come back to maritime trade and the merchant classes. So the 18th century witnessed the rise of a new merchant elite in Drogheda. Families who accumulated wealth through trade and translated it into social influence. Among these and from social influence into urban transformation, which is kind of what I'd be mostly interested in. Among these were the Godfreys, the Jebbs, the Pippards and the Armitages. I selected these as kind of prominent and interesting merchants to look at because their ledgers and correspondence survive, some of which is preserved in the local county Louth archive. And they show an impressive range of activity. For example, in 1754, John Godfrey recorded shipments of linen yarn worth over £4,000 sent to Liverpool, while his return cargoes included colonial sugar and rum imported through English intermediaries. Another significant merchant at the time in the town, Richard Jebb, maintained a fleet of small brigs and sloops that serviced the regular Drogheda-Liverpool route. These records reveal the town's active participation in what I would consider the interconnected web of Irish-British commerce that fed the Atlantic economy. Corporation minutes also illustrate the town's efforts to align itself with English mercantile standards. In 1762, Alderman George Scholes was commissioned to procure English slates and, significantly, English workmen for the repair of St. Peter's Church. Such details remind us that economic ambition was accompanied by cultural aspiration. This is the pursuit of refinement and civic identity. I actually think if I go ahead a little bit, we'll be able to just get a quick look at that St. Peter's Church of Ireland. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. But it's an interesting building because a lot of, well, the majority of the local support that went into building this, and we can see that through the records in the church vestries. The money really comes from mostly mercantile trade, and significantly a lot of that is on what is transatlantic trade. So to look at one thing in particular, an aspect that Drogheda is sort of still almost kind of people have an awareness of it is our particular propensity for linen trade and production in the 18th century. And perhaps more important to Drogheda's architectural development than the importation of actual building materials is its involvement in the linen trade. The town's prosperity in the 18th century, particularly the very end of the 18th century, rested upon flourishing linen industry that expanded not only within Drogheda but throughout Louth, Meath and a lot of the northern Midlands. Linen production had been encouraged by government policy since the late 17th century as a kind of reaction to restrictions that had been placed on wool exports. These had been forced on Irish enterprise. So you can see the merchants doing a bit of a workaround and moving towards flax and linen. The town's hinterland produced both flaxseed and linen yarn, much of it destined for export. Drogheda's merchants were lively scenes on markets, were lively scenes on market days, filled with carts from surrounding parishes, bringing hanks of yarn to be weighed, inspected and sold. Merchants like, again, John Godfrey and Richard Jebb made fortunes trading flaxseed and cloth across the Atlantic. Their wealth was invested back into the town through new homes, warehouses and civic buildings. These are symbols of community confident in its place within the wider world. The Linen Hall, which was erected between sort of 1770 and 1774, you can see this very large, austere brick structure with very regular fenestration or very regular placement of windows and a very unadorned red brick. All of that would reflect both a mercantile discipline, similar to what you would see pre-industrial complexes or places of labour found throughout the British Empire. There's a utilitarianness to the design, but there's also a conscious emulation of what's happening across the British Empire. During this period, Drogheda ranked third among Irish ports exporting linen to Liverpool, being surpassed only by Dublin and Newry. Exports peaked in the 1780s when some 30,000 spindles of yarn left the port annually. Merchants based in Liverpool, such as Henry Pippard, who we mentioned just a little bit previously, who seems to have had a lot of family in Drogheda, he capitalised on the trade and owned ships carrying Drogheda's product across the Irish Sea and indirectly into the Atlantic economy. Alderman Edward Cheshire the Younger was the main driving force behind the establishment of this new linen hall in Drogheda, which was active by 1774 and expanded, I should say, in the 1780s. The Cheshire family seem to have been instrumental in the development of the linen trade in Drogheda and appear to have had substantial means. Alderman Cheshire and his son Edward, also Edward, I guess, among many of the town merchants and gentry, donated money to the rebuilding of St. Peter's Church of Ireland, which was supervised by Hugh Darley between 1748 and 1752. Just on a side note there, the Darley family, a particularly interesting building family, a bit of a mafia style through two centuries. They seem to have a domination on all civic building throughout Ireland. You can find their fingerprints everywhere, from Trinity College, Parliament buildings, and local areas, not just Drogheda, but Newry, County Down, County Meath in particular. They had owned quarries as well. So if you ever see me writing anything about them, you know I'm still digging. I want more. They're very, very accomplished stone cutters in particular, and that is quite clear from the wonderful work here at St. Peter's Church of Ireland. But to bring it back on track, the Cheshire family, who I'm discussing, they were instrumental not only in the erection of St. Peter's Church, which is very significant, but also a building that we kind of all know very well is the Tosel in Drogheda, sort of a place of meeting more than anything in the town, meeting outside under the clock, and Tosel was always a big thing with my family. So the Cheshire family first lent £500 for the building of the Tosel, and then they lent a further £400 to the Drogheda Corporation. Again, this was just to pay the master builder George Darley, brother of Hugh Darley, who had just built St. Peter's Church of Ireland, and a further £800 in 1768. So with my maths being as dreadful as they are, that is £1,700, which I don't see any evidence in the corporation books of him ever being reimbursed for. He may have been, but I can't find any evidence of it. And Edward Cheshire the Elder, when he died in 1766, his son really appears to have continued on in his various business very successfully. He was in charge of the linen trade essentially in the town. He was paid by the corporation for putting out and taking in linen tables in the linen markets. Again, later was responsible for the linen hall. I mentioned it today, it's kind of sad, is we believe that Edward Cheshire, I believe that this was his house. From the deeds, I've been able to pin down that this is Alderman Cheshire, and he would have owned the property all the way back up. It was leased from William Ogle from 1758 by the Cheshires and built for them. Although now in a very bad state of decay, the house was originally quite large. And from some of these images that I have had access to very kindly, you can see the surviving interiors show what maybe previously once was very grand for a townhouse. And I think, judging by the scale, it's kind of hard to get a very good photograph of this because of how narrow West Street is. But if you're standing in front of this building, the scale of it is very similar to the Barlow House. So in terms of prestige and in terms of the type of person living here, they would have seen themselves, I'm guessing, as on par with that type of clientele, Singletons, Barlows, sort of the elite of the town at the time. To move back on now, the linen trade itself was primarily one with England. Most linen produced in Drogheda and its hinterland was traded with cities and towns on the west coast of Britain, and from there it's shipped further afield. However, despite close relations between merchants in Britain and Drogheda, I have come across a few attempts throughout the 18th century to try and circumvent the English ports altogether. So just to take a step back and understand, in the 18th century, the majority of the linen that was produced in Drogheda would be of not the finest quality. It was known as grey linens. And these linens were particularly coveted by the poorer classes in England and the rest of the UK. But most particularly, along with the provision trade, they would have been shipped to the likes of Liverpool and Bristol, and from there shipped to the colonies for the use of slaves. So my research has been kind of edging towards looking at how there's been much more sort of indirect engagement in the transatlantic slave trade and the transatlantic trade in general at large. A lot of then what gets shipped back is things like sugar, rum, things from the plantations that go back to Liverpool, and a lot of the time end up in Drogheda before they reach Liverpool, or go to Liverpool and then are purchased back into Drogheda. So just to get a context of what I mean by this sort of transatlantic or triangular trade. For linen in particular, when they tried to circumvent the English ports altogether, they were less successful. Some interesting examples, James Ford, who was a freeman of Drogheda and was made mayor in 1771, he's seen to have carried out some sort of semi-regular trade with the American colonies, mostly importing wheat from Baltimore and Philadelphia. And then he would bring back flaxseed as well for sort of he would bring it back to all the ports within the Boyne Valley. Ford was, from my interest and how I became aware of him, is he was mostly a building speculator when he was in Ireland, in Drogheda. He was responsible for the houses you can see here at Paradise Place, built from 1777. These houses have undergone significant changes, but I think they do retain their 18th century regularity. The character is still there. You can see the sort of the symmetry and the attempt at Gibbsian door cases that sort of blocked surround around the doors. It's quite typical of Irish Georgian architecture in that era. I won't go into other aspects that have been done to these houses, but it's great that they still survive. Originally, you can see they would have originally been 4 houses, obviously at least until maybe 1805, and that's when you start to get what are known as Wyatt windows. These sort of, when they can't fully do a very large window, but their techniques in glass allow them to at least do a slightly larger 1.5. Evidence also would suggest that James Ford himself built the former Presentation Convent House on Fair Street. I'm not sure if people would be familiar with that. It's number 11 Fair Street. I think the Order of Malta might be in there at the moment. It's just at the very top of Duke Street. Anyway, whether Ford had any success in these international endeavours is unknown. It seems unlikely. Ford had tried his hand at importing flaxseed from the American colonies in 1774. He introduced himself to the Baltimore-based firm Salmon and Wolseley. Wolseley represented the business in Baltimore while George Salmon remained in Ireland. Which is quite typical of business at that time, family and familial connections were really the only way you could trust, particularly in a very precarious business such as shipping and trade. They dealt with lots of Irish merchants. They usually exported wheat, flour and flaxseed to Irish ports over the country. Ford wrote to George in 1774, who in turn sent letters to Wolseley in America. He was requesting wheat and flaxseed, but we can see that the order was particularly difficult to fill due to poor harvest that year, which would in turn increase the cost. In addition, Ford found out that he would also be Ford required a shallow draft vessel that could tread in only 12 foot of water. So what that would suggest to me is that the Drogheda port, despite numerous attempts of improving, still wasn't really in a position to have deep hull ships come in, and it was still going to be a difficult port to navigate. The request seemed difficult to fulfill, and he was advised to charter a vessel in Ireland, as one obviously in America would have been quite difficult to attain. We see Ford never knocked back. He approaches a new firm, Jonathan Jackson, who were this time based in Newbury and Boston. And again, we follow Ford's insistence on using a shallow vessel to import flaxseed. The firm were quite surprised, found from the suggestion Ford made to use a sloop. I don't know how familiar you are with a sloop ship, but it's like a very awkward yacht. It's for want of a better word, it's quick to maneuver, but the idea of it's a single-decked ship trying to do a transatlantic voyage in it would be like getting on a raft. It'd be, if any of you have seen Castaway, it's not that far away. So obviously the firm wrote back and said, I thought it was quite a nice way, they do seem bewildered, but they said, a single-decked vessel and in this winter season would hardly be prudent. Which I thought was quite a nice way of telling him to cop himself on. Instead, Ford was recommended to get a vessel made at their port and have it sent to Ireland. To just reiterate as well, Ford, even if he had pulled this off, it wouldn't really have been the best idea in terms of not only the risk, but if you think of the small amount of cargo that would have fitted on a ship that size, providing very little room for not only provisions or emergency supplies, but even a crew. So I feel it seems doubtful that Ford could have pulled this off. And it does seem that he left Drogheda very abruptly in 1782 for Dundalk to escape financial difficulty. That's the only thing that I read. It's in a newspaper. The details that have not become clear. But he appears to have landed on his feet in Dundalk because the next year he has become agent for Lord Clanbrassil's estates. So you don't have to worry too much about him. And obviously Ford wasn't the only Drogheda merchant finding it difficult to source vessels. So I did think it was interesting this came up again in a similar year. The merchant in question this time being a man called Thomas Matthews, a family that became much more well known in the 19th century in Drogheda, but they were even in the 18th century a family of very prosperous Catholic merchants, sort of unusual for their time. They also sent a letter to the Baltimore firm, again looking for flaxseed. But Matthews had the exact same problem as Ford in acquiring a vessel small enough to be able to enter Drogheda port, but still large enough to do a transatlantic voyage. Wolseley essentially said if you wanted to do business in the future, procure a boat in Dublin and then see how things progress. Again, clearly the need to improve Drogheda's harbour was there despite the sort of piecemeal attempts to improve it. And it is taken much more seriously at the very end of the 18th century and to the early 19th century. There are major works done. Again, it seems Matthews ultimately failed in his endeavour to import flaxseed from Baltimore, at least in 1774. But he did continue to prosper, and I know the economic historian John Fitzgerald did record that Thomas Matthews was one of the leading merchants in Drogheda within the 1780s. And by the early 19th century, you see his descendants inherited Mount Hanover, which is a very large house just on the outskirts of Drogheda. So again, you can kind of see all this prosperity is feeding into the built environment. Lastly, within this sort of era, it's just to look at that sort of Atlantic connection and some of the moral complexity that brings for a historian or for anyone, I guess. Just this idea that behind Drogheda's prosperity lies a broader and more complex world. The Atlantic system of commerce that linked Ireland, Britain, Africa and the Americas. While Drogheda itself was not a slaving port, some of its merchants were entwined with those who were. The Haywood family offers a very telling example. Originally Drogheda merchants, the Hayworths relocated to Liverpool in the 1720s and became prominent bankers. Indeed, their bank, Arthur Haywood's bank, which he set up, eventually became bought out by the Bank of Liverpool and was assumed into what today is Barclays Bank. So not completely insignificant. They became prominent bankers and investors in the transatlantic trade, including the slave economy. Their rise from provincial traders to colonial financiers reflects the moral entanglement of commerce in the 18th century. And it also, again, I'm going to go back a slide here, but just some sort of direct and interesting ones, despite the fact that the Haywoods would have been dissenters, actually, so not of the established Church of Ireland. They did send money, Arthur Haywood sent money back for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Church of Ireland. He's recorded as a significant donator. His mother lived the rest of her life in Drogheda and owned a house on Dyer Street, and seems to have been investing a little bit. Her husband, Benjamin, Arthur's father, was also related and a signatory at the last will and testament of John Graham, who would have built Platten House, just what used to be outside of Drogheda until it was knocked in the 1960s. So all that sort of intertwined connections. It's all about family. It's all about who you know. Other figures like Robert Armitage and Henry Pippard, who I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, they maintained business links between Drogheda and Liverpool, trading linen and provisions alongside goods connected to the wider Atlantic system. Records also indicate that Drogheda ships carried provisions, beef, butter, grain, all destined for English ports in turn to supply colonial plantations. While the extent of Drogheda's direct involvement in slavery obviously remains uncertain, its economic fortunes were clearly tied to the same networks that sustained it. The port's prosperity was built in part on the flow of capital that slavery and the transatlantic trade had generated. Irish ports were never far from the shadow of empire, even if their sails stayed close to home. And that's kind of the way that I would sum that up. The physical transformation of Drogheda mirrored its economic ascent. The wealth generated by maritime trade found expression in brick and stone. Georgian houses rose particularly along the North Quay, West Street, Lawrence's Street, and indeed Fair Street in particular. And their symmetrical facades and classical ornamentation announced the confidence of a prosperous merchant class. Alderman Edward Cheshire, also merchant and magistrate, balanced commerce and governance. Minutes from the 1750s note his role in, again, regulating the grain trade, paving streets, and maintaining the Tosel. He championed civic order and improvement, embodying the belief that prosperity and moral virtue, for want of a better phrase, were intertwined. Together, Ford and Cheshire bridged this medieval corporation and modern mercantilism, aligning Drogheda's civic aesthetic and governance with English provincial towns similar to Bristol and Liverpool. And public buildings, to some, they also reflect this spirit. The Tosel, again, rebuilt in 1770, stands as a great symbol of civic governance. And I think its elegant arcade and clock tower would have been visible from the quays as boats approached the port of Drogheda. St. Peter's Church, repaired under Alderman Scholl's supervision, boasted English slates and fine joinery. The custom house, which is no longer there, completed around the mid-18th century, would have greeted ships immediately as they entered the Boyne. This is just directly adjacent, for those of you who are unfamiliar, just if you can see off kilter, the mayoralty house would be here, and then the bridge going over to Scotch Hall. So just at that centre, it's one of the first buildings that you would have been greeted with as you entered. And it's a proud statement, I'd say, of Drogheda's maritime authority. Architecture in Drogheda thus became a signifier of status, communicating industry, order and ambition, but also hierarchy. Behind the red brick elegance, and it's important to remember, of merchant houses, there lay in the 18th century also tenements, cabins, and the invisible labour of those who sustained the town's prosperity, which there's very little physical evidence survives. I think sometimes it's the lack of evidence that speaks the loudest. By the close of the 18th century, Drogheda had evolved into a thriving port, its skyline punctuated by church spires and warehouses. The Napoleonic Wars and shifting trade patterns would later alter its fortunes, but the 18th century remains the foundation of its urban identity, and I would argue that it remains to today. I mean, most of the 18th century buildings that I've discussed do survive, despite what's on this slide. We'll go back to one that's still there. The Thosal, again, restored, reinterpreted, remains a civic landmark, and each building and each street carry within them the imprint of the town's mercantile ambition and the moral complexity of its prosperity. When we walk through Drogheda's historic streets, past Georgian doorways, church spires and the quays, we are, in a sense, reading a palimpsest. Layers of ambition, exchange and adaptation. Each brick, each cornice tells a story of enterprise, but also of entanglement within the wider world that we can't easily separate. To understand this past is not only to celebrate Drogheda's industriousness, but to recognise the interconnectedness of local and global histories. As we preserve, hopefully, and interpret Drogheda's built heritage, I would say let us also acknowledge the complex currents of trade and morality that shaped it. In doing so, we not only honour the town's past, but enrich its place in the shared story of the Atlantic world. Thanks.